Chapter 14 of This Country of Ours. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This Country of Ours by H.E. Marshall. Chapter 14. More Adventures of Captain John Smith. Smith had been away from the settlement nearly a month, and he returned to find the colony in confusion and misery. Many had died, and those who remained were quarreling among themselves. Indeed, some were on the point of deserting and sneaking off to England in the one little ship they had. They were not in the least pleased to see Smith return, and they resolved once more to get rid of him. So they accused him of causing the death of the two men who had gone with him, and condemned him to death. Thus Smith had only escaped from the hands of the Indians to be murdered by his own people. The order went forth. He was to be hanged next day. But suddenly all was changed. For a man looking out to sea saw a white sail. "Ship ahoy!" he shouted. "Ship ahoy!" At the joyful sound the men forgot their bickerings, and, hurrying to the shore, welcomed the new arrival. It was Captain Newport with his long-promised help. He soon put a stop to the hanging business, and also set poor Captain Wingfield free, for he had been kept prisoner ever since he had been deposed. Newport had brought food for the colony, but he had also brought many new settlers. Unfortunately, too, one day the storehouse was set on fire, and much of the grain was destroyed. So that in spite of the new supplies, the colony would soon again have been in the old starving condition had it not been for Pocahontas. She was resolved that her beloved white chief should want for nothing, and now every 4 or 5 days she came to the fort laden with provisions. Smith also took Captain Newport to visit the Powhatan, and great barter was made of blue beads and tinsel ornaments for grain and foodstuffs. After a time Captain Newport sailed home again, taking the deposed President Wingfield with him. He took home also great tales of the savage Emperor's might and splendor, and King James was so impressed with what he heard that he made up his mind that the Powhatan should be crowned. So in autumn Captain Newport returned again to Jamestown, bringing with him more settlers, among them 2 women. He also brought a crown and other presents to the Powhatan from King James, together with a command for his coronation. So Smith made a journey to the Powhatan's village and begged him to come to Jamestown to receive his presents. But the Powhatan refused to go, for he was suspicious, and stood upon his dignity. "If your king has sent me presents," he said, "I also am a king, and this is my land. 8 days will I wait here to receive them. Your father Newport must come to me, not I to him." So with this answer Smith went back, and seeing nothing else for it, Captain Newport set out for the Powhatan's village with the presents. He did not in the least want to go, but the king had commanded that the Powhatan was to be crowned, and the king had to be obeyed. He arrived safely at Weronocomoco, and the next day was appointed for the coronation. First the presents were brought out, and set in order. There was a great 4-poster bed with hangings and curtains of damask, a basin and ewer and other costly novelties such as never before had been seen in these lands. After the gifts had been presented, the Englishmen tried to place a fine red cloak on the Powhatan's shoulders, but he would not have it. He resisted all their attempts until at last one of the other chiefs persuaded him that it would not hurt him, so at last he submitted. Next the crown was produced. The Powhatan had never seen a crown, and had no idea of its use, nor could he be made to understand that he must kneel to have it put on. "A foul trouble there was," says one of the settlers who writes about it. "No persuasions or explanations were of any avail. The Englishmen knelt down in front of him to show him what he must do. They explained, they persuaded, until they were worn out. It was all in vain. The Powhatan remained as stolid as a mule. Kneel he would not." So at length, seeing nothing else for it, 3 of them took the crown in their hands, and the others pressed with all their weight upon the Powhatan's shoulders, so that they forced him to stoop a little, and thus, amid howls of laughter, the crown was hastily thrust on his head. As soon as it was done the soldiers fired a volley in honor of the occasion. At the sound the newly crowned monarch started up in terror, casting aside the men who held him. But when he saw that no one was killed, and that those around him were laughing, he soon recovered from his fright. And thanking them gravely for their presents, he pompously handed his old shoes and his raccoon cloak to Captain Newport as a present for King James. Thus this strangest of all coronations came to an end. This senseless ceremony did no good, but rather harm. The Powhatan had resisted being crowned with all his might, but afterwards he was much puffed up about it, and began to think much more of himself, and much less of the white people. Among others, Smith thought it was nothing but a piece of tomfoolery, and likely to bring trouble ere long. For some months now he had been president, and as president he wrote to the London Company. "For the coronation of Powhatan," he said, "by whose advice you sent him such presents I know not, but this give me leave to tell you, I fear they will be the confusion of us all, ere we hear from you again." Smith told the company other plain truths. They had been sending out all sorts of idle fine gentlemen who had never done a day's work in their lives. They could not fell a tree, and when they tried the axe blistered their tender fingers. Some of them worked indeed cheerfully enough, but it took 10 of them to do as much work as one good workman. Others were simply stirrers up of mischief. One of these Smith now sent back to England, lest the company should cut his throat. And Smith begged the company to keep those sort of people at home in the future, and send him carpenters and gardeners, blacksmiths and masons, and people who could do something. Captain Newport now sailed home, and Smith was left to govern the colony and find food for the many hungry mouths. He went as usual to trade with the Indians, but he found them no longer willing to barter their corn for a little copper or a handful of beads. They now wanted swords and guns. The Powhatan too grew weary of seeing the Palefaces squatting on the land of which he was crowned king. He forgot his vows of friendship with Smith. All he wanted was to see the Palefaces leave his country, and the best way to get rid of them was to starve them. But although the Powhatan had grown tired of seeing the Palefaces stride like lords through his land, he yet greatly admired them, and now he wanted more than anything else to have a house, a palace as it seemed to him, with windows and fireplaces like those they built for themselves at Jamestown. For in the little native houses which his followers could build there was no room for the splendid furniture which had been sent to him for his coronation. So now he sent to Smith asking him to send white men to build a house. Smith at once sent some men to begin the work, and soon followed with others. On their way to the Powhatan's town, Smith and his companions stopped a night with another friendly chief, who warned them to beware of the Powhatan. "You will find him use you well," he said, "but trust him not, and be sure he hath no chance to seize your arms, for he hath sent for you only to cut your throats." However, in spite of this warning, Smith decided to go on. So he thanked the friendly chief for his good counsel, and assuring him that he would love him always for it, he went on his way. It was winter time now, and the rivers were half frozen over, the land was covered with snow, and icy winds blew over it. Indeed, the weather was so bad that for a week Smith and his men could not go on, but had to take refuge with some friendly Indians. Here in the warm wigwams they were cozy and jolly. The savages treated them kindly, and fed them well on oysters, fish, game, and wild fowl. Christmas came and went while they were with these kindly savages, and at length, the weather becoming a little better, they decided to push on. After many adventures they reached the Powhatan's village. They were very weary from their long cold journey, and taking possession of the first houses they came to, they sent a message to the Powhatan, telling him that they had come, and asking him to send food. This the old chief immediately did, and soon they were dining royally on bread, venison, and turkeys. The next day, too, the Powhatan sent them supplies of food. Then he calmly asked how long they were going to stay, and when they would be gone. At this Smith was greatly astonished, for had not the Powhatan sent for him? "I did not send for you," said the wily old savage, "and if you have come for corn I have none to give you, still less have my people, but," he added slyly, "if perchance you have 40 swords, I might find 40 baskets of corn in exchange for them." "You did not send for me?" said Smith in astonishment. How can that be? For I have with me the messengers